The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 5th day of this Rohatsu Sesshin in December 2021 at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And I'd like to share with you today as a continuing part of our sharing of the fact that what we do in Zazen, what we're searching for in Zazen is universal. It doesn't matter what religion we're in, or we've been brought up in, or we're drawn to, still, at the deepest level, it is the same truth. It may have different names, but sort of like in Zen practice, there are different terms in the Rinzai sect for things such as the nested bowls that we use to eat with. Those are Jihatsu and Rinzai. And in the Sotoshu, they are called Ordioki. The so-called encouragement stick that we don't use here, but is traditional in temples in Japan, is called Keisaku in Rinzai, Kyosaku in Soto. We have Doksan in Soto for the meeting with the teacher for guidance, and in Rinzai it's called Sanzen. So there's lots of different terms for things, and that extends all the way to this ineffable, what cannot be named, but in order to somehow communicate it, about it, which of course also cannot really be expressed, we have different names. And so today I'd like to share with you some of the poems of Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi. He has got umpty-ump different names. He was born in, actually, it's not clear whether it was actually in Afghanistan or in a village that was in Tajikistan, kind of next door. But he was born in that part of the world to a father who was also something of a spiritual mystic. And at a certain point when China was invaded by the hordes of infidels, then he moved his family further west because they were coming towards Persia, and they continued wandering here and there. His father had quite a name for himself apparently as well, and eventually Rumi as well inherited his father's mantle as an Islamic teacher and as a Sufi mystic. And it was in Konya, Turkey, where they finally settled, or where he finally settled, where what was developed was called the Mevlevi, or the whirling dervishes. And they still practice in Turkey today. In fact, when I was living in Turkey and going to architecture school there in 1974, 73, I think it was, some of my fellow students were renting buses to go to Konya because there was going to be I think it was the 700th anniversary of his death in Konya, and there was going to be actually a public whirling. Normally the whirling dervishes are quite hidden. They don't advertise themselves, and certainly not in public. And at this point, it was going to happen. But I had, at the time, I had a project due in class, the following Monday, and I also had 2 kids and a husband at home. So it just wasn't going to happen. And it didn't. But some years later, I actually did travel to Konya to Rumi's tomb. And the tomb is he's entombed along with his father. These are caskets, the very uniquely shaped caskets that they have in that part of the world. And so he is so-called buried, except he's not buried. And you can see the caskets right there on standing on the ground, along with, I think, his sons. But he was a deeply realized mystic. And let me share with you some of his poetry to help you understand that. And I'm going to share first from this book, The Enlightened Heart. And these are translations edited by Stephen Mitchell and collected by Stephen Mitchell. And this is what I've been sharing throughout these Rohatsu Teishos from various different sources, Buddhist, Christian, and now Sufi. Totally conscious and apropos of nothing, he comes to see me. Is someone here? I ask. The moon, the full moon, is inside your house. My friends and I go running out into the street. I'm in here, comes a voice from the house, but we aren't listening. We're looking up at the sky. My pet nightingale sobs like a drunk in the garden. Ringdoves scattered with small cries. Where? It's midnight. The whole neighborhood is up and out in the street, thinking the cat burglars come back. The actual thief is there in the crowd too, saying out loud, yes, the cat burglar is somewhere in this crowd. No one pays attention. Lo, I am with you always means when you look for God, God is in the look of your eyes, in the thought of looking, nearer to you than yourself, or things that have happened to you, nearer to yourself than things that have happened to you. There's no need to go outside. Be melting snow. Wash yourself of yourself. A white flower grows in the quietness. Let your tongue become that flower. And of course, the most important part of this is, lo, I am with you always, means when you look for God, God is in the look of your eyes, in the thought of looking nearer to you than yourself, or things that have happened to you. There's no need to go outside. Be melting snow. Wash yourself of yourself. A white flower grows in the quietness. Let your tongue become that flower. Nearer to yourself than who you think you are. Nearer to yourself. And somewhere there's a saying, the eye with which you see God is the eye with which God sees you. And another poem. I've lived on the lip of insanity, wanting to know reasons, knocking on a door. It opens. I've been knocking from the inside. And another. I'm going to have to get some help with this. Okay. Who should I seek? His essence speaks through me. I've been looking for myself all along. His essence speaks through me. I've been looking for myself all along. We so assume that what we seek is outside of ourselves, and yet it is not. There is no inside or outside. And as a matter of fact, when the inside and the outside become one, as the saying goes, then you're much closer to recognizing it. We think of ourselves as separate individual people with separate individual experiences. And what these experiences are depends on how we perceive of them. There's a saying, two men look out from prison bars. One sees the bars, the other sees the stars. And then there's the half empty, half glass full sense. How we see things determines how we feel about them, how we feel about ourselves, how we feel about life. Now, of course, certain kinds of things happen to people that hopefully would never happen to anyone, and yet they do. And trauma is a result of that. And it's important to really, really get some expert attention, professional attention to working with that trauma. But in terms of ordinary stuff, we get angry, we get frustrated, we get scared. There's a book that made a big difference in my life many, many years ago called Focusing. And the background of that book, as some of you already know, is there was at the time, a graduate student in psychology named Eugene Gendlin, Gendlin. And his project was to investigate why some people could do therapy for years and years and years and years and still stay stuck. And others within a very short time, 2 or 3, 4 sessions maybe, could become free. And he and his mentor were trying to see if they could discern what made the difference in this. And out of that came this book, Focusing. Because as it turned out, those people who were successful in moving on from their caught places, as a good friend of mine calls it, were able to focus inwardly on the sensations in the body, as uncomfortable as they might have been. And through that, insight often arose as to the source of the problem and the solution. Moreover, whether or not there was insight into the source of the problem or the solution, freedom often resulted simply from that tuning into the experience in the body, what he termed the felt sense. And that has been successfully used in many different forms of therapy ever since. For me, it worked miracles, really, because at the time that I discovered the book, this is way back in the very early 80s, I was quite shut down. Dissociated is the word, technically, and for good reason. My growing up had not been particularly happy or healthy. In fact, it had been terrifying. And so in order to avoid feeling terror all the time, I had buried it. And in order to bury it, I had to shut everything else down. And that is something to recognize too. If you find yourself not able to really feel things in a given moment, if you feel like you're sort of seeing the world in two dimensions or you're frozen, it is because you are. It's because you're not fully present. And the way into that presence, where life is rich and fulfilling, even if it is challenging, is through that felt sense. What helped me especially was to journal the felt sense, and that's why we teach it to the women veterans with PTSD. And in the beginning, I couldn't find a felt sense other than a sort of a feeling that there was this great amorphous cloud that was in my mind. There was me. And so I wrote that down. And then by tuning in, it shifted enough that I could write down what the next sense was. And then the next. And that's all it took, was 3 sentences. And it was quite amazing. Of course, that was the beginning. And I had to utilize that after that as well. And I still do. And it's interesting that this way of focusing within was actually taught by a very famous Tibetan master, Longchenpa. And it is expressed in a book called You Are the Eyes of the World. And that title alone is a teaching. You are the eyes of the world. And this is what Rumi was doing. He was tuning in. When he speaks of having a question and knocking, and discovering that he was actually knocking from within himself. And let's share something else, because many people, probably most people, unless they've had a near-death experience, the older we get, the more frightened we get of death and dying. And this comes up in Zen practice as well, because they don't call it the great death for nothing. Coming to awakening, we have to let go of who we think we are, that self-image, at least temporarily, because that's exactly what causes us pain and suffering, is an attachment to that self-image, an attachment to having to be a particular person, and to constantly defend it, constantly support it, be in anguish when it's challenged, be embarrassed when it's brought up short. So this is what Rumi had to say about death. I died as a mineral and became a plant. I died as a plant and rose to animal. I died as an animal and I was man. Why should I fear? When was I less by dying? Yet once more I shall die as man, to soar with angels. But even from angelhood I must pass on. All except God perishes. When I have sacrificed my angel soul, I shall become what no mind ever conceived. Oh, let me not exist, for non-existence proclaims in organ tones, to him we shall return. We have died many, many times over, and being reborn. And those people who have near-death experiences have been said to lose their fear of death. This is not a recipe for killing yourself to get out of suffering, because that does not work. If there is suffering and you try to avoid it by killing yourself, you're only compounding the problem, because not only will you return to birth, but you'll return to birth both with the unresolved challenge you were trying to escape, as well as the negative karma of having destroyed yourself before. So it's not a recipe for success, except through opening to who you really are, tuning in to who you really are, exploring all the ways you think you're somebody, and moving beyond it by seeing through it. Who we are is miraculous and beyond miraculous. When we allow ourselves to simply rest in the moment as it is, life becomes richer and more fulfilling. Not only that, but we instinctively have a sense of how to move through life. We don't have to think our way through it. When we tune in and rest in a total presence of the moment as it appears to be, then all manner of avenues open up, and there's a sense of which direction to move in that is absolutely correct. And it is amazing what happens when we live that way. It's a challenge getting there, however, because most people don't come to Zen practice when they're feeling really fine and at ease with life. We come because there's something of concern. We're yearning to return to our true home. There's a sense that there's something we're missing that we need to return to. Or as happened with Mitra-roshi, what is the difference between how the Germans reacted to being held on criminal charges following the war versus how the Japanese responded to the same charges? What was the difference? And what about that essence of peaceful, deeply peaceful sense he found in the Buddhist temples in Japan when he was there for those war crimes trials? Or the man who came to visit Mitra-roshi back in the late 60s, late 60s, I think it was, who had been in the invasion of Normandy, which was an incredibly brutal battle. And he survived, but when he returned to the United States, all he could do was wander the streets of New York City in a daze. How can there be such suffering? How can there be such suffering? He couldn't hold a job. All he could do was wander aimlessly through the streets, bumping into telephone poles in his search. And after 6 months, he had a kind of an awakening experience. It wasn't very deep though, and he had no way to keep it going and to deepen it. So by the time he came to see Mitra-roshi more than 20 years later, it was a dim memory. And Roshi said to him, if you want to get that experience back, if you want to open again to that freedom and that peace, do Zazen. But he never saw the man again. So it's not sure whatever happened to him. But Zen practice is not something everybody is drawn to. We can be grateful that we are sitting here doing Zazen in this session, because it will make a big difference. It will make a big difference. Who we think we are is a collection of stories. Yes, there are some experiences that impact that. But that's not who we really are. And if that's not who we really are, then who are we? Rumi talks about knocking and discovering that he was knocking from the inside. He thought he was knocking outside, searching for an answer to his questions, and then discovered that he was all things, that there was nothing outside. There's a big leap to that deep experience from where most of us sit right now. But through the Zazen, in particular, through the extended out breath and the inhabiting the body, tuning in to the felt sense with a sense of openness to possibility, that if you tune in deeply enough, long enough, as happened to Einstein when he discovered his famous discoveries, the answers will simply arise and you'll know. And of course, and this needs to be said again and again and again, because initially it was not recognized, and it's not really recognized these days in most places that are doing Zazen. Having a Kensho experience is not sufficient. There's several aspects of this to be considered. One is that in the process of coming to a Kensho, which literally means seeing into the true nature of reality, you bump into where you're caught, where you're not seeing. And that can be frustrating. It can be annoying. It can be fearful. It can be angering. It can be discouraging. But right there is a tremendous opportunity to do deep work, to let go. And it's essential, both in order to have the ground when we do have a Kensho finally, that it can be supported, unlike the man who wandered the streets of New York City. We want it to last. We want it to inform our lives. And in order for that to happen, we have to overcome the obstacles that prevent us from seeing it, from recognizing it, because it's there all the time. The other thing is what Doré Enji, who was Hakuin's most important Dharma successor, called the long maturation. And that is to, as soon as we begin to see what Suzuki-roshi called mind weeds, or manure for the practice, as soon as we begin to see where we're caught, we tune in, own it, recognize it, and vow not to behave in that way again, to change that habit pattern. And that much alone can make a big difference. And then the next time we would automatically react through that habit pattern. It's almost as if this stoplight comes on and blinking light says, well, really, do you really want to do that again? Do you really want to carry it on again? And there is your opportunity to not do it. And it's easy. But this is all part of the practice of Zazen. As someone so long ago said, this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. But in order to become free, you need to be willing to see where you're caught and to work with that, and not to simply shove it under the carpet. It's amazing what Zen practice can accomplish if we are willing to give ourselves to it with persistence, with patience. In fact, that term is actually called patient endurance. So hanging in there despite. There's a there's a cartoon that Chisan at Sogenji had posted in her room, and it's a line drawing of a big bird, a stork, something like that. And in the stork's mouth is a frog, and the frog is got his little front legs grasped around the neck of the stork, and that is the caption wrote, "Hang in there." So if you're willing to be in for the long haul, the results will be phenomenal. If you're not, you'll be dancing around the edges of the lake, trying different things. Some a little bit successful, others not at all, but none of it truly deeply successful. But Zazen, fully engaged in for however long it takes. And I have been doing this myself for more than 45 years. And I still find places where I can work. And my life has been so different from when I started. Same can happen to you. So I think that's enough for today. Remember Rumi. His words are quite pertinent to us today, even in Zen. So thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.